I'll say the opening prayer. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I know there's some smart minds out there that lead the discussion. Amen. Better than mine. So today we're going to have a three-part discussion. I'll call it a discussion. We're going to be done at 12:15. The first part's going to be some Roman history, what was going on at the time, the people from Acts, when the disciples, apostles were going. We're then going to watch an 8-minute and 16-second graphic, I call it a cartoon. It's from the Bible Project website, and it's going to cover the first part of Acts. Lonnie has endorsed this as being theologically very sound. Just so. And then we'll get into the discussion. So here we go. My name is Steve Peters. I'm the junior warden. I focus on buildings, grounds, and money. I do the non-spiritual stuff in the church, which is why I'm perfect for this, because this isn't going to be all that spiritual. But I love the history of the time. So why don't we start with that and go to the first. There we go. Let me just make sure we got this right. Okay. This is what the world looked like in about 350 BC. This is the Persian Empire, also called Parthia. And this is pre-Alexander the Great. And you can see it ran from all the way from India, all the way up to the edge of Greece, up in Thrace, and so on. So they ran the show. All of Asia Minor and all of the Holy Land. Modern day Tehran is probably right in there. So historically, one of Caesar's first triumvirate friends, Crassus, went in there to try to conquer the Persian Empire and got destroyed and killed. And the Romans lost standards there, which is like awful. Mark Antony, in trying to prove himself as a great person, went into Parthia, tried to conquer them. Logistically, he couldn't deal with it. He lost some battles, he had to leave, and Cleopatra actually had to bail him out. And Julius Caesar was going to go in there, but the Ides of March cut that short. In fact, Octavius, the soon-to-be Augustus, was already in Greece here, getting ready to stage the attack into Parthia. So it never happened. You can see how big it is. It was a very tough environment. No, there we go. So here's the Roman Empire. This is from about 117 AD. And one of the things I want to point out is that everything east of the Holy Land is now Roman. Everything in here is still the Parthian Empire. You see a dotted line going up from the word Syria up through, it says Pontus, and then Armenia. That was Augustus, had a truce with the Persians and said, the left side is mine, the east side is yours, and let's not cross each other's line. And so he settled the conflict without a battle, and he got his standards back. But as you can see, the apostles went to the west. They didn't go into Parthia. The Roman Empire at that time, yes.
What are standards?
Say again?
He got his standards back?
Yes, yeah, the legions, when the legions went into battle, they had a big pole with a big metal standard, and each legion had a separate thing, and then they marched in, and those things were sacred. And the Romans lost some standards occasionally. One in Parthia, they lost some in 9 AD in Germany. So, at the next one. Okay, this is my work here. These are all the Roman emperors at the time, Acts, and then what followed. So first of all, you have Augustus. That's when Jesus was born. And he had the truce with Parthia. Tiberius, that's when Jesus lived and was resurrected. Caligula, some pretty good movies about Caligula. He was kind of a questionable guy, finally got assassinated by his own guards. But during Caligula and Claudius's and Nero's reign, there began to be some revolts, some simmering, some rumblings in Judea. It's kind of the well in advance of the Jewish wars. And you see Paul's mission starts during Claudius. Nero gave the Christians a backhanded compliment, which was huge for Christianity. The fire in Rome, Nero was out of town, he comes back, he gets blamed for it anyway, and he needed a scapegoat. And he picked on the Christians, and he specifically excluded the Jews. He said this new Christian sect is the cause of the fires, not the Jews. And the reason he separated the Jews out was because there was rumblings going on in Judea and he didn't want to upset them anymore. But having separated them into two distinct groups turned out to be a huge thing for the Christians. Vespasian finally came in after Nero. He built the Colosseum. His son Titus, before he became emperor, waged the final war on Jerusalem. It was Titus that tore down the temple. And he became emperor for a couple of years. Now let's fast forward down here. Right now we're entering the Pax Romana. This is when Rome was evidently the most peaceful place in the world. Emperor Trajan, he was from Spain, became emperor, and Trajan had a written discussion about the Christians. Unfortunately, I didn't get a slide on this. Hang on just a second. But you'll all bear with me. And my glasses. Trajan had a governor in northern Asia Minor, which is now like Istanbul over to the Black Sea. And this governor was named Pliny, Pliny. Pliny's uncle was killed at Vesuvius trying to rescue people. Pliny was a writer, among other things, a senator, patrician family, but most of his writings survived. So Pliny the Younger writes a letter to Trajan and says, I'm the governor here, and what do I do about these Christians? He says, people are starting to accuse people of being Christians. They're tattletaling. I've talked to a couple of them. The word is out. And so he even got an anonymous pamphlet with lists of people who were Christians. One of the issues that the Christians were, some of them kind of separated themselves from daily society. That was the first thing. Second thing, the Romans didn't like secret societies. There were, back in the Roman Empire, there were things called collegia, trade unions. There were societies, we could get together and form a burial society, so we'd pool our money so when someone died, they could at least have a burial. All that stuff was out in the open, but a secret society meant to the Romans treason. They were going to revolt, and they had no time for them. They viewed the early Christians as part of a secret society. That was just the way they felt. So anyway, Pliny, not knowing what to do, writes a letter to Trajan. I'm going to just read a couple of things. The very fact of my taking up this question as to the Christians has caused even more of them to be brought before me. Now, this is probably the most important thing. In talking to some Christians, Pliny got the story of early Christians and what they were doing, and he wrote about it to Trajan. And this is about their services. One of the Christians said, on a stated day, they were accustomed to meet before daybreak, to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, and then by oath, they would agree to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, breach of faith, and they wouldn't steal money that had been entrusted to them. this ceremony was concluded, their custom was to depart, but meet again for food, but it was of no special character and it was harmless. And then Pliny says, but this still is a secret society. The reason this was important, because this is one of the earliest records we have today of how early Christians got together and worshiped. It was communal. But Pliny didn't stop writing. And again, he got more information and passed it on to Trajan. Many persons of ages and both sexes alike are brought before me by their accusers. The contagion of this superstition Christianity has spread not only through the free cities, but into the villages and rural districts. That was a key line, because what this told scholars, what by 112 AD, about 80 years after Christ, Christianity had penetrated well beyond the border of Rome and major cities into the provinces southeast of Italy. Pagan temples had been deserted, large towns, villages, rural districts were teeming with Christians. So the reason I say this, because in Acts, we're going to talk about what the early disciples did. And they were a success. That's the punchline right there. They did it. But look at the danger they had to deal with. In Acts, you see a lot of the Jewish tension between the early Christians. And then the Romans, while they were tolerant of the Christians to some degree, they were not, they weren't happy to have them. Let me finish. Trajan responds to these letters, and that's preserved as well, because Pliny's writings, had this. And Trajan said, there's no hard and fast rule that can be laid down. Christians are not to be hunted out. But pamphlets published anonymously may not carry weight whatever, no matter what the charge may be, for they are not only a precedent of the very worst type, they are not the conscience of the spirit of our age. Having said that, if you said you were a Christian and you didn't pay homage to the empire and the Roman gods as well, you could be in trouble. But there you go. I do like the fact they didn't like anonymous tips. So the other reason the Romans didn't like Christianity, they were afraid that the early Christians were going to claim an exemption from service in the legions that a lot of the Jewish people had. So in trying to keep peace, it was Julius Caesar first granted this, that some of the Jewish communities didn't have to be in the legions, and that was fairly widespread by this time. And the last thing the Romans wanted was less people to serve in their legions. So I think by the time Christianity has spread, the legions were filled with young Christians. Okay, now we're going to go to the card. Oh, but this is, before we watch the Bible Project, this is just a chart that I found that shows how the book of Acts is divided up, written by Luke the doctor, started 33 AD, probably finished up in the mid-60s, various sections, and you can see the various topics. I love this. This is my kind of chart. Just lays it out there. So now, why don't we go to the Bible Project? This is on the book of Acts, and it's just part 1. If you're with me next week, you're going to get part 2, which is about Paul.
The book of Acts. It's the second volume of a unified two-part work that today we call Luke Acts. These were written by the same author, Luke, who was a traveling co-worker with Paul. This is clear from the book's introduction, where Luke says, I produced my first volume, that's the gospel, about all the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. Now Luke's giving a clue here as to what this book of Acts will be about. Volume 1 was about what Jesus began to do and to teach. Volume 2 will then be about what Jesus continued to do and teach. Which leads to a really interesting point about the book's traditional but not original name, the Acts of the Apostles. While different apostles do appear in most of these stories, the only single character who unifies the whole story from beginning to end is Jesus himself, acting directly or through the Spirit. And so the book would more accurately be named The Acts of Jesus and the Spirit. The book's introduction recounts how the risen Jesus spends some 40 days with the disciples, teaching them about the kingdom of God. This connects back to the story of Luke's gospel, where Jesus claimed that he was restoring God's kingdom over the world, beginning with Israel. So he called Israel to live under God's reign by following him. And he was enthroned as king when he gave up his life and then conquered death with his love. And so the book of Acts begins with the risen King Jesus instructing his disciples about life in his kingdom. So he promises that the Spirit will soon come and immerse them in his personal presence. And this fulfills one of the key hopes from the Old Testament prophets, that in the Messianic kingdom, God's presence, his Spirit, would come and take up residence among his people in a new temple and transform their hearts. And so Jesus says, when this happens, the Spirit will empower his disciples to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. From here, Jesus is taken up from their sight in a cloud. It's an image drawn from the book of Daniel, chapter 7. It shows how Jesus is now being enthroned as the Son of Man who was vindicated after his suffering and now shares in God's rule over the world. And so he promises that he will return one day. And so the main themes and the design of the book of Acts flow right out of this opening chapter. This is a story about Jesus leading his people by the Spirit to go out into the world and invite all nations to live under his reign. And so the story will begin with that message spreading in Jerusalem and then into the neighboring regions of Judea and Samaria full of non-Jewish people, and then from there out to all of the nations into the ends of the earth. This video is just going to focus on the first half of the book. So the Jerusalem-focused section begins with Jesus' followers waiting until the Feast of Pentecost, when all of these Jewish pilgrims from all over the ancient world were in the city. And the Holy Spirit comes on the disciples as a great wind, and something like flames appear over each person's head, and together they start announcing and telling stories of God's mighty deeds. And they're speaking in all of these languages that they didn't know before, but all the people gathered there understand perfectly. Now, in order to see what Luke's emphasizing in this story, it's crucial to see the Old Testament roots of all of these images. So first, the wind and the fire is a direct allusion to the stories about God's glorious fiery presence filling the tabernacle and the temple. And it's also connected to the prophetic promises that God would come and live by his Spirit in the new temple of the Messianic kingdom. And so here in Acts, God's fiery presence comes to dwell not in a building, but in his people. Luke is saying that the new temple promised by the prophets is Jesus' new covenant family, the people of Jesus, which connects to the second thing Luke is trying to say here. So the prophets promised that when God came to dwell in his new temple, he would reunify all the tribes of Israel under the Messianic king, and that the good news of God's reign would go out and be announced to the nations. Luke describes in detail the international multi-tribe makeup of all of the Israelites who were there at Pentecost and who responded to Peter's message. And so the apostles keep calling Israelites to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah, and thousands upon thousands respond, forming new communities of generosity and worship and celebration. But not everybody's celebrating. From here, Luke shows how Jesus' new family quickly faced hostility from the Jerusalem leaders. With a really beautiful symmetrical design, Luke tells a tale of two temples. So God's new temple, the community of Jesus' followers, they're gathering every day in the temple courts and from house to house. Now, in between those notices are two stories about Peter and the other apostles healing people in the temple courts, only to get arrested by the temple leaders, followed each time by a speech of Peter claiming that Jesus is the true king of Israel. And at the center of all this is a story about Jesus' followers donating property and possessions to a common fund to help the poor, which is really cool, but it seems kind of random for Luke to mention it here until you realize that this was a practice described in the laws of the Torah and was supposed to be happening through the Jerusalem temple and its leaders. So Luke's point here is clear. The new temple of Jesus' community is fulfilling the purpose that God always intended for the Jerusalem temple, to be a place where heaven and earth meet, where people encounter God's generosity and healing presence. And this conflict between the two temples, it culminates in Acts chapter 6 and 7. It's the first wave of persecution. So Jesus' followers, they continue to multiply, requiring more leaders. And one of these, Stephen, he's a bold witness for Jesus in Jerusalem. And he ends up getting arrested, and he's accused of speaking against and even threatening the temple. And so Stephen here gives a long speech showing how Israel's leaders have always rejected the messengers God sent them, including Jesus and now his disciples. So the Jerusalem leaders are enraged. They murder Stephen, and they launch a wave of persecution against Jesus' followers that drives most of them from the city. But it has a paradoxical effect. Luke shows how this tragedy actually became the means by which Jesus' people are now sent out into Judea and Samaria. Now in this section, Luke has collected a diverse group of stories that all show how the mostly Jewish Jerusalem-based community of Jesus became a multi-ethnic international movement. So first is the mission of Philip into Samaria. It's the land of Israel's hated enemies, and many of them come to follow Jesus. Next we have the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul. He was the sworn enemy and persecutor of Jesus' followers until he personally met the risen Jesus, and he then became a passionate advocate on behalf of Jesus. Next is the story of Peter having a vision about how God doesn't consider non-Jewish people ritually impure or unworthy of joining Jesus' family. And so Peter, he's led by the Spirit into the house of a Roman soldier. It's full of non-Jewish people, and they all respond to the good news about Jesus. In fact, the Spirit shows up powerfully upon them, just as he did to the Jewish disciples back in chapter 2. These themes all come together in the founding of the church in Antioch, the largest, most cosmopolitan city in that part of the Roman Empire. And Luke, he tells us that Barnabas, a Jewish leader from the Jerusalem church, went along with Paul to help lead this church community. And so it became the first large multi-ethnic church in history. It was where Jesus' followers were called Christians for the first time, and it's from here that the first international missionaries were sent out. And so we see Jesus' commission coming true, and this takes us into the rest of Luke's story. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Acts.
When my wife and I lived in Turkey, we did go to ancient Antioch called Antakya. We did find, quote, was the first Christian church, whether it was or not, but we were there. And it was built on the side, inside a cave, and they had hacked an altar out of the stone. Who knows? They had a massive earthquake there last year, the year before, and so I don't know what actually remains, but it's beautiful location, beautiful city, and right near a big U.S. air base. Actually, it's a NATO air base. So. Okay. There's the Bible Project has, the St. John's Bible has some beautiful paintings. This is the Pentecost with the Spirit coming down. Book is here. You're welcome to look through it. And then, okay. These are some of the things that Peter did. We mentioned, the Pentecost. This one is the deacons. The disciples were out spreading the word, but they were also helping the poor, the sick, and the needy. And they got people like Stephen to come in to pick up the deacon duties, which was to distribute the food, to help the poor, and whatever, so the disciples could just go out and preach. And it was Stephen who, in front of a lot of Jewish leaders, gave an impassioned speech. And it was so well received, they dragged him out in the street and stoned him to death. And Paul was there, according to the book. So, but that's how deacons were started. There were 7 or 8 of them. And Stephen was the first one who had been picked. I don't know if he was Jewish, but he was from the area. And he, anyway, paid for his beliefs. So he's the first martyr. I want you to go to the next. These are some questions that I just kind of came up with. And I'd like to focus on, wait a second. No, actually, this is the wrong one. This is, there we go. No. This is what Peter did. There's another chart here that that's what Peter did. I had one more with questions. Yeah. This is Paul's stuff. This is next week, by the way. You're getting a preview. Okay. I had one more chart that who knows. I just had some basic questions. And there are people here that are going to know the answers to this. So I don't. These are questions I don't know the answers to. So, why did Peter take the leading role after the resurrection? The power to heal. Who else besides Peter had that? The Spirit came down, but Peter had healing powers, evidently. So I'd like to have someone talk about that a little bit. The story of Stephen. Why was that there? I mean, why did Luke, who wrote this, thought it was? The other thing, the ascension happens during the first few chapters of Acts, but it's just kind of mentioned. Jesus went up to heaven. It wasn't covered very. The other question, that I had was Pentecost, and the Spirit came down on Pentecost, which is a Jewish holiday. It's 50 days after Passover, I think, and it's both to celebrate the Torah being passed on to Moses, but it's also to celebrate the wheat harvest in Israel. So it was a fairly big holiday, which is why so many people were in Jerusalem when the Spirit comes down. So there's some of the thoughts that I had. So I'd love to hear any or all comments. We've got about 20 minutes. Yes.
That was really cool, first of all. I love all the history. It just brings a whole other dimension to it. I really appreciate it. And I really like these questions too. One of the things, especially the one about why did Peter get these powers?
Yeah.
What came to mind was two things. One is, going through the Old Testament, so in the first part of this year of the Bible, one of the things that we saw over and over and over is the people that God picks are not the ones that have it all together necessarily, and I think in the New Testament we see Peter just doing dumb stuff over and over and over and over again, and I think maybe that kind of connects it back to this other pattern that it's not the people that have it together, and I think maybe part of the reason why is because that's a lot of power, and I think somebody who's used to making mistakes might be a little less vulnerable to misusing it. You know what I mean? In kind of a paradoxical way that. I know other people have talked about the connection between healing and wounds in the first place, and it's the person who's probably maybe the least qualified might be the best person to take up that mantle. That's just what came to mind.
Yeah, healing was a big deal. Let me go back. I'm going to go back and find the right one. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Healing was a big deal. The Romans and the Egyptians and the Greeks were very good at anatomy, but they didn't know about diseases as much. So they knew all the organs of the body, but they didn't know how to cure them. And so if you could healing powers, that was very important. In fact, one of the emperors I mentioned, Vespasian, he's the one responsible for the Colosseum. Before he was emperor, he'd gone to an oasis in Egypt where he was granted these special powers to heal. And of course, he came out and he claims to have healed a couple of people. And that's what emperors ought to be able to do. But who knows?
Who's gonna argue with him?
Well, I know exactly.
I'm sure he did, yeah.
But I think you're right, that healing was a very important part of, people feeling the Spirit. So, yes,
Were you asked why Peter was the one that was given the
yeah.
gift of
I mean, there were 11 other disciples who are now apostles.
Well, Jesus had stated, this is Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. And like you said, healing would get people's attention. So presumably, he was given special powers
Yeah,
to focus attention on this new religion, this new spirituality.
Yeah.
In fulfillment of what Jesus said. It's just a thought.
yeah, no, I think it's good.
I
Eric,
think one thing really on the positive side for Peter is he was very stubborn. And, they talk about success and failure not being so much how many times you mess up or get knocked down, but how many times you're willing to get up and try again.
Yeah.
And he really seems like one of those people, even if he royally screwed up, he'd get up and try again. And he would just step out there in faith and do things, even if he messed it up. Be like, okay, well, I'll try it again, whatever the thing may be. So there might be something to that with his ability to heal and step out there and do things in faith,
Yeah, Peter really took the lead early, and essentially one of the conflicts that came up in later years was with Paul as, could you be a Christian but not have to follow the law? And Paul became a big believer in you could be a Gentile without following the law and be a Christian. Peter and some other people weren't quite there. So that was a big deal. But the healing, you're right, it does get attention. And frankly, it would be today too. If you personally saw someone get healed like that, it'd be huge. So, let's talk about Pentecost. I'm kind of intrigued by why do we think the Holy Spirit came down on Pentecost, which coincided with the big Jewish festival, actually for the wheat harvest. Plus, they celebrated the Torah being passed on to Moses. So, was it just coincidence? Did it really happen then? One of the things we know from like our Christmas time coincides with, the Saturnalia, some of the other festivals, just as the days were starting to get longer. The shortest day had happened and the longest days were getting longer. I talked to Lonnie about this earlier today, and he says he still can't figure out how Easter moves around back and forth, different dates. I don't get it either. But it certainly does, and there's a real method to it. But anyone's view on, the first Pentecost? Was it a coincidence? Was this something Luke just wrote about years later? Did it really happen? The Spirit is clearly around. It's just a question of when it came down and,
Steve, I think it was a symbol or God's way of sending the people out to spread Christ's message. It was sort of a turning point, saying, okay, you've had enough time to grieve, been fearful here in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Now it's time to take this movement and move it out into the world. And what better way than to sort of breathe the Holy Spirit into all of these followers in a very dramatic way.
Kind of what Lonnie was talking about this morning. The Spirit's, it's there, it's around. Yeah, that's always with you.
Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, it was just occurred to me that all those people were gathered and they're gonna be going home, so they might as well spread the word by taking it all the way back home.
Correct.
Yeah, one other thing I think that fits in with that too is the connection to the seasons and the earth and the land and the actual harvest of the wheat. Because you know, in story after story in Jesus' parables, he's always talking about using harvest as a metaphor, and even wheat itself is what the bread was made out of for you know, what later became communion. So I think in addition to like the logistics of having all these people together as an audience that would then disperse and carry it further, which also is, you know, it's kind of similar to the way plants and pollination work too. Is there's the actual physical symbols of harvesting and the wheat itself.
One of the other thoughts I got from reading this was, it was not easy being a Christian initially, and there is always a risk. And we come to church and we feel good, we come back from church, you know, but just general safety is always pretty important. And here, as we saw what happened with the governor Pliny, people were tattletaling on Christians like they were bad people. And what were the Romans going to do? And these people might revolt and try to overthrow, but, you know, all kinds of stuff. I was pretty intrigued by Trajan's answer. We're not going to hunt them out. They're basically good people. I think 100, 200 years later, it got worse until perhaps Constantine. But at this point, they were not going to be hunted out. And I think, frankly, a lot of them ended up getting into the legions. And one of the important things about the legions was they were spread out over the empire. So I'm sure, you know, one of the ways Christianity may have gotten up into England, into Gaul, was through the legions. They were there. And also in Spain, Portugal, North Africa. Augustus spread the legions out around. He only kept a Praetorian guard in Rome for his protection, a couple thousand people. But there were, you know, 200,000 or 300,000 legions people at any one time, recruited from all around the empire. And it was, frankly, Augustus did something really good. He said, if you serve 16 years in the legion and you're still alive, you're going to get a pension, and I'll try to get you some land so you can be a farmer. And you can become, some of them could become Roman citizens, which actually all of them did later on. But the legions spread an awful lot of, you know, of things. Yes.
One, and this is just me, a really simplistic way that I've thought about Pentecost is the disciples just had all of the 40 days where Jesus had appeared to them and kind of given them instructions. So they kind of knew all the things of, okay, now we know what we're supposed to do. And I kind of get this feeling of them being in these meetings together. It's like, okay, we know what to do, but we've got to plan how we're going to do it. And they were bogged down in this planning. How are we going to make this happen? And it wasn't until the Holy Spirit came upon them, they're like, we get it, we're inspired now, we know what to do.
Yeah.
You know?
Good. Any other comments? Yes.
Probably the part of Pentecost that I like the most is the aspect of language and the fact that the Holy Spirit gave people the gift of speaking other languages and being understood by other people, because I think it shows that Jesus' message is not just for one people or to be spoken in one language, that it was always meant for everyone across the world. And language and ethnicity often get wrapped up in politics, and people can get very possessive. I think that happens even in America. Americans think that Jesus spoke English and that we are a chosen nation, and I don't think that's necessarily true, that we're chosen amongst all people, because I think Jesus' message is for all people, and having his words spoken in many different languages is both symbolic and practical. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think also Luke put in the story of the the Ethiopian eunuch, just to show that you don't have to be in Judea to be a Christian, and you can be who you are and be a Christian. Lonnie said that so perfectly today. It was great. And the second thing, when he goes to see the Roman centurion and his family, I was reading where some scholars think that was a nice story that Luke put in just to make a point, could have happened. But it did show how the legions were people from all over the empire, and here Cornelius, accepts Christ along with his family. So symbolically, that was very important message to get out, that it was okay to be in the legion and be a Christian. So next week is the second part, which is going to focus on Paul. The official assignment for me was some of the books of the epistles, but I'll tangentially cover that through what Paul did and when he wrote things. Let's flash ahead and I'll show you the. Keep on going. Oh, if you go back, here you can see this is Paul and when his missions took place and when he wrote letters. Just so you can see how he was. This was an active thing, and then you see his trips. I mean, he was everywhere. Really pretty. But that's what we're going to talk about next week. In the meantime, we have the Bible here to look at, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.